There's a moment in every generation when the world turns toward its young people and asks a quiet but urgent question: what comes next? And if we're being honest with ourselves, the early years of the 21st century made that question impossible to ignore. Because everywhere you looked, from the streets filled with protests to the digital spaces where ideas seemed to travel faster than truth, you could feel a shift, a recognition that the old ways of doing things were straining under the weight of new realities. Climate change was no longer a distant warning. Inequality wasn't an abstract statistic. Technology was reshaping our relationships, our attention, even our sense of community. And in the midst of all that, it was young people who stepped forward, steady and unafraid, insisting that the future wasn't something we inherit, it's something we build. The real question is, are we ready to listen? Because if you look back at the early 2010s, you see a world in motion, a world caught between the fading echoes of one era and the tremors of the next. You had systems built for a slower time, trying to handle problems that were accelerating by the day. You had communities wrestling with the promises and consequences of a digital revolution that connected us more than ever and fractured us just as quickly. And yet, out of that tension emerged something remarkable: the courage of young leaders who refused to stay silent. They organized, they marched, they used the tools of their time, social platforms, global networks, shared stories to confront crises that older generations struggled to solve. Movements for climate justice, gun safety, racial equality, each one sparked by the simple belief that the world could be fairer, safer, more humane than the one they were given. It wasn't naive, it was necessary. And for a moment, the world was reminded that hope often begins at the margins, carried by those who are told to wait their turn. And when I think about why that matters, I think about the places where I first learned what community meant. I think about the neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago, where young organizers showed me what conviction looks like long before I ever held public office. They didn't have titles. They didn't have wealth or influence. What they had was a belief that if you care about something deeply enough, you show up, you knock on doors, you sit in church basements and community centers and listen to the stories people are almost afraid to tell. And sometimes you discover that the people with the least power on paper possess the strongest clarity in practice. Later, in the rooms where laws were written and decisions carried enormous consequence, I saw that same clarity in young staffers who stayed late, pushing for fairness in ways that didn't make headlines but changed lives. And I saw it in my own daughters, who would come home with questions that cut through noise and politics and ego, questions that reminded me that wisdom isn't age-bound. Sometimes it's rooted in the fresh eyes of someone who believes the world can still be better than what it is. But if you sit with those memories long enough, you start to see the deeper truth beneath them, that the struggles of this generation, the ethical dilemmas about privacy and misinformation, the tension between freedom and responsibility, the urgency of protecting a planet that's running out of time aren't obstacles meant to break us. They're tests meant to guide us. They remind us that every society is measured not by how loudly it celebrates its values, but by how faithfully it hands them to those who come after. And they force us to recognize a simple paradox. Progress demands both humility and boldness. Humility to admit that we don't have all the answers. Boldness to empower those who see what we cannot. Because democracy, at its core, is a collective effort, a long, winding conversation between generations about who we are and who we aspire to be. And that conversation only works when everyone has a voice, especially those who've been told they're too young to understand the world they're already helping to shape. And so when we talk about why young voices matter more than ever, we're not talking about idealism for its own sake. We're talking about resilience, the kind that grows from refusing to accept the world as it is. We're talking about creativity, the kind that sees beyond the limitations of the moment. We're talking about hope not as a feeling, but as a strategic choice, a discipline, a commitment to keep pushing even when the road is long and progress feels slow. And we're talking about responsibility, the responsibility of older generations to listen, to share power, to recognize that leadership is not diminished by welcoming new ideas, it is strengthened by them. Because when young people are empowered, societies don't just change, they evolve, they find new energy, new solutions, new ways of rediscovering the humanity that binds us. In the end, the question isn't whether young people are ready to lead. They already are. The real question is whether the rest of us are willing to make room for the future they're fighting for, whether we're willing to hear their call for justice, for equity, for a world where every person has the chance to breathe clean air, pursue opportunity, and live with dignity, whether we're willing to see their courage not as a challenge to the old order, but as an invitation to build something better together. So maybe the questions we should all be asking right now are these. What kind of world are we preparing to leave behind? What truth are we willing to hear from those who will live with the consequences of our choices? And when the next generation knocks, not asking for permission, but for partnership, will we open the door?